Now I want to talk a little bit about how the Bible works, okay, and what we should be thinking about when we're reading the Bible. So I really wish that when I first became a believer, which doesn't seem very long ago for me, that somebody would have told me this is how the Bible works. But nobody did that. Okay, nobody did that. I started to get really confused, and God, blessed me with just going to seminary and getting more confused, and then finally starting to shine a little bit of light after my first year there. Right? It's not the seminary that did it. It's just that you spend enough time in the Bible that you start to piece some things together. But I was also getting some very good teaching from some very godly men. And so I just want to thank them so much for doing that. But how the Bible works, what we want to think about here is we want to think about the Bible as history, okay? The documents that we're reading are historical documents, right? Passed down through the centuries, right? And we still get to go to them and read about them and read them. And what do they hold? They hold true events. Right? They hold true events. They actually happened. You can plot them on a timeline. And a lot of times we like to mix, or separate Christian history and, secular history. And we don't like to put them together, except for on rare occasions. But I'm telling you, you need to put them together and keep them together. Just keep them together. Don't separate them. They are history. Just plot them together. No more separation. Just keep them together, and when you read the Bible, put on your historical thinking cap, and the Bible is going to make a lot more sense to you. And here we go. I'm going to show you how to do that. So today, how the Bible works, we're going to talk about perspective. Okay? Perspective. I don't know if you liked art in school. I really liked art in school. I wasn't very good at it, okay? I could draw the stick figure pretty good. I was pretty good at that. But anything beyond that, drawing a hand, that's the hardest thing I think that anybody can try to draw, right? But they have a way of drawing in perspective, right? You've learned the first perspective when you want to draw that train track, right? That railroad track that goes into one point, and then it allows you to have, the telephone poles lining straight up and not just laying down. That's the perspective, right? But then there's 2-point perspective, and man, that's amazing because now you can build a house, right? You can draw a house, you can draw a box, you can draw the sides of the box, but there's something good about 2-point perspective is that you can show the bottom of the box, you can show the top of the box, or you can show the side of the box, depending on what perspective you're looking at, right? Or you're using, or where your horizon line is, or where your eye is going to be going, right? But it's still 2-point perspective. But there is 3-point perspective as well, right? And there's probably more. I never got farther than 3-point perspective, to be honest with you. But if you like superheroes, which if you haven't noticed, I like Batman a lot. If you read comic books, they're going to be, I think, now don't hold me to this, but I think they're going to be using 3-point perspective because you're not only seeing the top of the building, but you can also see it stretching down. And so it gives you this stretched look, which is super cool, which isn't something that you really get in 2-point perspective. In 3-point, you can see it kind of vanishing down into, out of view, but you can also see the top and the sides, and it's really cool. I like 3-point. I've never really advanced in it. But besides just art, perspective can go into our Bibles as well, okay? Not just the drawing, but this is what it's about. So when it comes to perspective in the Bible, there's 3 perspectives that you need to be aware of. Okay, there are 3 main perspectives that you need to be aware of. And the first one is the Christian perspective. And that perspective is you and me, and the cross is the hinge, okay? All the events before the cross helped bring the cross into existence. And all of the events after the cross helped bring into existence. That's the Christian perspective. Okay, just in a nutshell, that's the Christian perspective. Now, there was this picture that I saw once, and it was probably at Hobby Lobby, maybe not, but I almost bought it, but I think it was overpriced, so I didn't buy it. But however, it was a picture of the baby Jesus, and behind baby Jesus, lying in a manger, there was this like bat signal being shown forth, and the cross was shadowing behind him, and It was like a beacon, right, for that cross. And I said to myself, that's the Christian perspective. We're looking at baby Jesus knowing that the cross is going to come. That's the Christian perspective. And the thing you need to be aware of when it comes to the Christian perspective is you need to know it exists, and you need to know that for most of this, you kind of want to put that Christian perspective in a little bag, tie it up, seal it up, and go put it over to the side for a moment, because we don't want that to hinder us as we're going to try and observe what's in the Bible by itself. Okay? There's other perspectives that we need to hold on to first, and then we go grab that little bag that holds our Christian perspective, bring it back in, and say, this is for us. This is what we need to know about it. Okay? So that's what you need to know about the Christian perspective. Know it exists so that you can keep it separate. Okay? Keep it separate. The second perspective is the author's perspective. Okay, the author's perspective. So when you're reading a letter, when you're reading a book, you want to know who the author is, right? And then you want to know their backstory. But not only that, when it comes to the author's perspective, there's this time delay feature in the author's perspective. There's the time in which the event takes place, and then there's the time that the account is written. Okay, and that could be 20 years later, that could be 30 years later, and you need to know what was going on during that time where he was writing, right? That's important, but it's also important to understand what's going on when he's writing, or when that account is being taken place. Okay, so you need to be able to keep those things separate. Now, the best way that I can describe this is that we have 4 Gospels, okay, and 3 of those Gospels, the great scholars of the day have determined that those are called the Synoptic Gospels. And if you know them, repeat them with me. They're Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the Synoptic Gospels. But then there is one that's not a Synoptic Gospel, part of the Holy Trio. There, it's John, right? And the reason why is because he kind of takes a different approach to the gospel, right? The other 3 are like, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And John's like, hey, let me tell you a little bit about Jesus, something you might not know. I'm just going to fill in some information, right? So he takes this other way of telling some of the same events. However, it's been thought, and I don't know if I buy into this, okay, but I'm just going to tell you what's been thought. What's been thought is that he writes his super late, okay, super late, and grace has existed for a long time, and he also knows Paul's message, and so he writes it in light of the Pauline epistles, right? He writes it with grace in mind. That could very well be. I mean, he wrote it later in life, so that very well could be, and that could be why it sounds different. I don't know and nobody knows for realsies, right? Nobody knows for realsies if that's the case, but the author's perspective is key in knowing that. You can also get the author's perspective to help with knowing the audience, right? The audience in which he's writing to. It's if he didn't have to explain something to the audience, you have to assume that the audience would know what the author is talking about. So let's use, for example, the synagogue, right? Let's use the example for the synagogue. So he says, the Jews went to synagogue to worship. Well, if he's writing to a group of people that know what a synagogue is, he probably isn't going to say, and the Jews went to the synagogue, and the synagogue is a place where the Jews go to worship, and they do this and that and the other, and then he goes on with his story. That's you can get audience from the author's perspective. So the other thing you can get from the author's perspective, which is super important, is the author's knowledge when he was writing, okay? And that's really easy to spot in Matthew. Matthew will tell you the story, and then he'll tell you why that event took place, and then, backed up with an Old Testament quote or something, and then that had to happen, so this would happen. And so when he says that has to happen, so this would happen, that's the author's perspective, the author's knowledge inside that letter, inside that book. That's the author's knowledge. And before that, that was the account that took place. So the author's perspective gives us a ton of information, and you need to know who the author is so you can fill in what that would be like. So let's talk about the last one. The last one we have here I call the real-time perspective, and this is key. And this is something that myself, I have to make a conscious effort to do. The author's perspective, I think it just kind of flies off the page. The Christian perspective, well, we got that. We know what that is. But what about this real-time perspective? This is where the studying comes in, and this is where the brain and the like history have to meet, right? A lot of studying goes into this part. And what this is, the real-time perspective, is seeing it through the eyes of those who lived it. It's basically strapping on their sandals, no matter how uncomfortable that would be, and walking a mile in their shoes, right? They didn't have Nike back then. They had, like Birkenstocks, right? They had those kinds of things on their feet, right? And they walked miles, right? They walked miles. So putting yourself in the character's perspective, seeing it through their eyes is so key that we should be doing its own video on that, because that is how you get to understand the Bible. You need to know who you're reading about. If you're reading about Joseph, learn as much as you can about Joseph and know what he would be thinking about as you're reading that account. Okay, it's very key. It's very key. So we're going to continue with the real-time perspective, and I'm going to just bring this home because this is something I use all the time. And so you actually have subcategories in this real-time perspective, okay? And you need to have the two. The first one is the Jewish perspective, okay? You have the Jewish perspective, and the second one is you have the Gentile perspective, okay? And I know the Gentile perspective pretty good, but you still need to be in the time frame in which you're reading, right? So you got to go back in time and you got to study the Gentiles' perspective for the time in which you're reading, right? Same thing with Jewish perspective. If you're learning about the Jewish way today, that's not going to be as helpful as learning about the Jewish time back in the Bible times, right? That's more important. So with the Jewish perspective, let's use that first. You need to know about the Orthodox Jewish perspective back in the 1st century and before, right? That's what you need to learn. And really, there's a couple groups here. There's the Pharisees, the Sadducees. I guess there's 3 groups. There's the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes. And you need to spend a little bit of time, just do a quick Google search and read about each of those groups and know how to spot them. Because when you come to them in the Bible, you're going to want to be able to say, oh, they're a Pharisee, they're a Sadducee, or they're a scribe, or they're part of the Sanhedrin. You want to know who it is you're reading about, right? You want it right up here. You want to have it right up here. Don't wait for your pastor to give it to you. That's cheating. Go ahead and get this for yourself. Go ahead and get it into your mind so that you yourself will have this Orthodox perspective as best you can, okay? Never going to have a perfect one. Never going to be able to know what that would be like exactly, but have it in your mind. Even if you want to do some of the feasts so that you understand what it would be like. Not that you have to do them, but you want to do them so you would know what it would kind of be like for them. That's a great way. Bring it home, teach the kids, let them see what it would be like to do some of these things. It's perfect. It allows you to get into the mindset of what the Orthodox Jewish people would be thinking about. Okay? The next one is the Hellenistic perspective. Right, the Jewish perspective. There's the Hellenistic perspective, and really these are the progressive Jews. Okay, these are the ones that kind of took on the Greek mindset. All right, and you need to know about that. They are also following the law, right? But they kind of have their own scripture, and it's called the Septuagint. Right, they have their own Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. So this is stuff that you need to put into your mind so that you can have that perspective. And the last one is the Judaizers, okay? The Judaizers. That's what you need to have in your mind. And the Judaizers really, they knew who Jesus was, but they also were holding on to certain parts of the law. Now, this is a question, and I'm not going to answer it for you today. This is the question. Was there a time in which the Judaizers were in the right? Think about that. Was there a time when the Judaizers were in the right and they weren't wrong? Okay, it's a question. You should try to answer it. But these three groups, you need to be able to spot them, and you need to know who belongs to these groups, right? So for example, if you watched my last video, you would know that Paul, before he became the Apostle Paul, right? He would be in that Orthodox Jew category, right? And you would want to know who a Pharisee is and try to figure that out so you could know his backstory. That's the group he would be in, okay? So just know that that exists, and you want to know so that when you read in the Bible, you know, a phrase that says, oh, okay, wait a minute, what group of people are these? Then you can put them into that, and you can gain that perspective, and you can be real time with them. Real time, not bringing your Christian perspective in, but being with the character in which you're reading about. It's super important, and it'll make the Bible come so much more alive to you. Okay, so now we have the Gentile perspective, and basically, you know, if you're reading in the Old Testament, you've got the past empires, right? You need to know about the past empires, so you can start, you know, all the way back in Egypt, right, which is absolutely one of my favorite ones to learn about, right? There's just so much going on in the Egyptian empire. And then you can also, you'll also want to know about Babylon, right? But then you're also going to want to know about the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites and all the other ites that are in there. And so you got some reading to do if you want to know about the past empires. But really, if you're in the New Testament, it's really Roman, right? You want to know about the Roman perspective, and you also want to know about Greek, right? I think there was a famous historian, I don't remember his name, but he said that Rome took over Greek, but Greek took over Rome, because basically Rome, and that's a very loose translation, by the way, that's not exactly what he said, but it's basically that Rome took over Greece, but the Romans loved the Greek way of living, so they kind of adopted that into their way of living, right? They liked their columns, they liked their way of building, and they liked that they were good thinkers. So they kind of took that, but they took them over, but they let them take the culture over, right? So that's kind of the perspective there. So this is the perspective you want to have in your mind as we continue forward in the Bible. And that's the real-time perspective. So now we're going to take this just one step farther, and I'm going to do hopefully like a word picture for you, just in case what I've been putting in there in words doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to me, but sometimes, you know, it's just for me, and for you, I want you to be able to really get that as well. So just to make sure that I'm making sense, I just wanted to take it another step farther. So here we have a timeline. Okay, this yellow bar represents the timeline, and here we're going to put a character there, and you're going to see that this is the real perspective. So if you're reading about Joseph, let's just say, okay, and you're reading about Joseph, that's who you want to know about. You want to know what he would be thinking about, what he's doing, and you also want to ask, how is God working with mankind while Joseph is living out his life? Is it under law or is it under grace? You want to get into that character. You want to know what he's thinking about. Okay, it's very key. It's very key. So then we're going to go ahead and put this big brick wall between our character and the future. Okay, we don't want him to be able to know anything past what we're reading about. Okay, we don't want him to be able to know anything about the future. The only way that he could know about the future is if God told him about it, right? And said, hey, you know, your son's going to save, you know, his people from their sins. Okay, so if he has that, well, yes, he knows that in the future, Jesus is going to save his people from their sins, but at this particular moment, that would be all he would have, right? He wouldn't have anything more than that, right? He would just have what he knows up until this point. So this is key. Then we're going to get the author's perspective, and you can see the author gets his, you know, knowledge from the future, right? He has future knowledge, but he also is writing about something in the past, right? He's writing about Joseph's life. So you need to try and keep those two perspectives separate, right? He's writing from the other side into the future, about something that happened in the past. But while you're reading that account that happened in the past, please stay in the past. It's really important that you don't mix time frames. If you start mixing time frames and you just grab this time frame, put it in the blender, hit mix, it all comes out as mush. And I'm going to tell you right now that that is a very confusing place to be when you're reading the Bible. So don't let that happen to you. Don't let it happen. Okay, so then we're going to talk about the last perspective. And the last perspective, as you can see, is the Christian perspective. And that perspective hovers over everything, right? You and I get the pleasure of seeing everything all at one time, right? But we have to be on our guard against our perspective, because we could say, well, this happened so that this could happen, and that happened so that this could happen, and that happened so that this could happen, and we might forget that the character in which we're reading about, or the account that we're reading about, the characters only know so much. Okay, the characters only know so much, and we need to remember that we need to live in their time. We need to let them shine in their time. On this idea of perspective, in all three of these things, think about how famous the birth of Christ is. And when it comes to the Christian perspective, it's very famous. We celebrate Christ's birth for a month, right? And if retailers have their way, we'll be celebrating it all year long, right? And as a Christian, yes, we can celebrate it all year long, but there is a month in which we prepare, we put up lights, we put up whatever, and that makes Jesus' birth very famous when it comes to the Christian perspective. When it comes to the author's perspective, it's not famous yet, but they're going to make it famous, right? It's not famous yet, but the author is writing it down so that other people can read about it. Soon to be famous is the way you could think about that. But then the real-time perspective, how famous is the birth of Christ? And it's not famous. Okay, it's not famous. And really, the only people that know about the birth of Christ is Mary, Joseph, and then, right, the shepherds know about it, the angels know about it, right, and then the wise men learn about it and come, and Herod learns about it and tries to kill all the babies and that kind of thing. But it's not famous at all. And in fact, after he's born, he goes to Egypt, right, and escapes the terror of Herod, and it's just a silent thing. It's just silent. Okay? That's the real-time perspective. Seeing the birth of Christ through the eyes of those who lived it, it wasn't a famous ordeal. In fact, the Jews kept doing the same thing. The Savior of the world had entered the world, but the world hadn't changed. Again, my name's Jay, and this has been Verse by Verse. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a blessed week, and I'll see you in the next video.